Hi, everyone. It's time to talk about supply. Good news for you is if you understood the basic concepts of what we talked about yesterday with demand, you're going to be in pretty good shape to talk about supply today. The concepts are the same in terms of the way that the graph works and the idea that there are external factors that can lead to a shift in the graph. We just have different external factors that we need to talk about. So let's jump into our PowerPoint real quick. And here we go. Again, there is a video from Mr. Clifford. If you are interested in watching that on YouTube, go ahead and search that out. You just search topic 1.5 supply AP macro and he'll pop right up. So a couple of reminders before we jump into supply about supply in general. Consumers are associated with demand and the demand curve and everything that goes with demand. Buyers and consumers control or shape the demand side of the equation, and businesses and producers shape the supply side of the equation. So consumers demand and businesses supply. So when trying to decide if whether or not something is going to affect the demand side of things or the supply side of things, ask yourself, does this situation have to do with a consumer's behavior, or does this situation have to do with a business or a producer's behavior? Because consumer behavior does not affect supply. Okay, some definitions for you guys. What is supply? It's the idea that there are different quantities of goods that sellers are willing and able to produce at different prices. So I might be willing to make iPhones, but newsflash, I'm not able to produce iPhones. And somebody might be able to produce something, but they're not willing to produce it. So you have to be able to be both willing and able to sell or produce something to be characterized into the supply side of the equation. And then we have what's called the law of supply. So in opposite relationship with demand, supply has a direct or a positive relationship. Demand has an inverse relationship. That's why the graph goes down. They say demand goes to the dirt and then supply goes to the sky. So demand to the dirt, supply to the sky is a helpful way of thinking about which graph does what its general shape is, especially when we start putting supply and demand next to each other. And then you're like, wait, which one is which? Demand goes to the dirt, supply goes to the sky. So there's a positive direct relationship between price and quantity supplied, which means as the price increases, the quantity that producers are going to make also increases. And as the price falls, the quantity that producers will make will also fall. Why? Because if people, as the price goes up, I'm going to make more of that thing because I can make more money from selling that thing. The higher prices go, it gives the profit-seeking for firms, businesses, some sort of incentive to produce more of the thing because they're going to make more money. Okay, a couple of other general reminders. When we're talking about shifts in the curve, shifts in the demand curve, shifts in the supply curve, never, 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 never are we going to use the terms that the shift is happening up or down. We're always going to talk about that the shift occurs left or right, and that will make it significantly easier when we start actually shifting the supply curve or actually shifting the demand curve, to remember that regardless if we're talking about supply or demand, an increase is going to shift the curve to the right, and a decrease will always shift the curve to the left. So don't draw up and down arrows. Don't talk about it shifting the curve up. We're going to talk about it shifting side to side from left to right. Okay, so just like when we were talking about demand, we also can make a coordinate system to talk about the relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. We call this the supply table. Before, we were calling it the demand table when I was asking you guys who would be willing to buy themselves an A at the different price points. Now we're talking about supplying a product. In this case, let's say you own a hypothetical lawn maintenance company. If the price for mowing the grass was $1, how many quantities do you think people would be willing to supply? If it was $5, how many quantities do you think people would be willing to supply? $20, $50, $100, $1,000. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that if somebody was willing to pay me $1,000 every time I produced a lawn mow service for them, I would be willing to supply hundreds and hundreds of lawn mows. But if I was only going to get $1, if I was only getting paid $1, I probably would maybe mow the grass one time for my grandma because I love her. But other than that, I'm not really very interested because there's not a lot of profit to make there. So I'm not really going to make a lot of lawn mowings. That's very awkward grammar, but I think you get the idea. So we can put it in a supply schedule. So let's use the analogy of milk. So at the price of $5, the quantity supplied is going to be 50, because if I can make $5 per unit that I'm selling, let's say it's a gallon, which actually that's a pretty good price for a gallon of milk, but let's just assume that that's a high price. At $5, the quantity supplied is going to be relatively high because there's a lot of profit to be made there. And then you can see the direct relationship: as the price falls, so does the quantity demand fall. And when we get down here to only $1, well, really, there's not going to be that large of a quantity of milk supplied. Again, price is what movement along the curve is controlled by price. But just like when we were doing demand, there are things that could potentially shift the supply curve, but they are different categories than the things that we dealt with demand. So for example, what if there's a new machine that is super productive and makes milking cows, you can do it in half the time? How do we think that's going to affect the supply? The price is going to stay the same, but now that we have this new Super Duty machine, we can get a significantly more amount of milk with the same cows that we have, because we can do it in half the time because we have this fancy machine now. So how does it affect our curve? It's going to shift it to the right, because an increase, we always shift to the right. A decrease, we shift to the left. So new technology means that we can get more milk, so our quantity supplies increases, so it shifts our entire curve to the right. The prices didn't change, but there's more milk being produced. What if the price for a dairy cow increased? What if buying cows, I'm a dairy farmer and I have to buy cows to run my dairy farm. And what if now all of a sudden, for whatever reason, the price of a dairy cow just like shoots up tremendously? How does that affect our supply curve? Well, what's going to happen now is that it's actually going to cause a decrease because cows are more expensive. So we talked yesterday about how the change in price of another good can affect the demand curve. The same thing can happen with supply. So it's kind of splitting hairs to say that a cow is an input into getting milk. But the idea that we have to buy the cows in order to produce the milk, if cows are much more expensive, I'm not going to have as many dairy cows on my farm. Therefore, I'm not going to be able to produce as much. So it's going to cause a decrease and it's going to shift to the left. The prices didn't change, but there's less milk being produced because cows are more expensive to buy. So people might not have as many cows on their farm. Okay, what are the 5 shifters, or the fancy schmancy word for this is the 5 determinants of supply. Yesterday we did the 5 determinants of demand. Now we're going to talk about the determinants of supply. First is prices and availability of inputs, or the inputs is a fancy word of saying resources. So we just did that exact example. If the price of a dairy cow, let's use the opposite. If a price of a dairy cow significantly decreases, now cows are cheaper to buy. So I'm going to have more cows on my dairy farm. What's that going to do to the supply of milk? It's going to increase the supply of milk. So a decrease in the price of the input goods is going to cause an increase or a shift to the right in terms of supply. The opposite could be true. What if we have a terrible round of mad cow's disease and 80% of cows in the country are killed because of the disease? Well, then we're going to have a significant reduction in the availability of input, or the resource that we need in order to make milk. So milk supply will significantly decrease, which would shift the curve to the left. The next determinant of demand is the number of sellers. Obviously, the number of people that are producing a particular good is going to have an impact on overall supply. So if all of a sudden we have a wave of people who say, hey, I feel like becoming a dairy farmer, and now we have twice as many dairy farmers, what's that going to do to supply? It's going to dramatically increase our supply. And so the graph will shift to the right. Next, technology. That kind of goes with the example that we did at the beginning. If some sort of brand new technology comes around that makes producing milk faster or cheaper, or with significantly less raw materials, or whatever it is, it improves the technology for making it milk. For making milk to make it more efficient, that is going to increase the supply. And of course, it would shift the graph to the right. Okay, let's talk about expectations of future profits. Just like with demand, when we were talking about future expectations, you're not going to go buy a TV the week before Black Friday. Why? Because as a consumer, you expect that the price is going to be different in a week. So you're going to wait to consume that product. Well, suppliers, producers think the same way. If I think next month my product is going to be worth more money, if I can sell it at a higher price in a month, let's say you, I don't know, you produce hot dogs and the National Hot Dog Festival is coming up next month. I'm going to hold back on my supply and wait until I can sell a whole lot more of it for a higher price because there's this event that's taking place. Okay, we have really yet to address the issue of government involvement in the economy. So here's our first dabble into that issue. If there's some sort of government action, either a tax or a subsidies, you're probably more familiar with the concept of a tax. So let's talk about what the heck is a subsidy. A subsidy is when the government pays money to an individual business or to a market in general. So they might just target one company and say, we're going to subsidize that one company, or they might say anyone who produces this particular good or is in this particular industry, we're going to offer subsidies to them. So it's when they pay money to these businesses, and the purpose behind this money is in order to encourage production of a particular good. So we're going to, let's say, we need farmers to grow corn, but there's not a lot of money in growing corn. But if we don't have enough corn, then we're not going to have enough food and people are going to die. And people dying on a massive scale of starvation is probably not a good way to get elected. So what government officials are going to do is they're going to create a subsidy and they're going to pay farmers money to grow corn. Or let's say we want to shift away from farmers growing corn and we really want them to grow soybeans. So in order to provide an incentive for these farmers to stop growing corn and start growing soybeans, they're going to offer a subsidy for any farmer that's willing to sell or to grow soybeans. So the idea here, what happens is that you're going to cause the supply of a particular good to increase because there's more money in making that particular good. So if you're, not only are you selling your product in the market and making a profit, but then you're also getting extra money from the government. So there's extra profits involved. So it's an incentive to produce a particular good in a particular industry. The opposite is true of a tax. I think a classic example of this is a tax on tobacco or a tax on alcohol. The government is trying to discourage people from smoking. And so what are they doing? They're smacking a giant tax on top of every pack of cigarettes. Well, yes, that tax eventually gets passed on to the consumer, but at first what's happening is the tobacco companies have to pay for every pack of cigarettes that they sell. They have to pay a certain percentage of that money to the government in the form of a tax. And so what happens is it's going to decrease the supply because there's not as much money to be made in profits because you're having to pay a portion of your sales to the government in form of whatever that tax is that they say it has to be. So the government can influence supply either by sweetening the pot and offering a subsidy and trying to get people to produce more of something, or they can kind of offer the stick, which is to say, hey, I'm going to discourage you from selling these particular things by making it more expensive to sell that product. Okay. Always, always remember, I hammered it home 100 times yesterday. I'm going to say it again. A change in price does not shift the supply curve. A change in price, all it does is cause movement from point A to point B to point C along the curve. Change in price of the actual product that's being represented in the supply curve will not cause a shift. All it does is cause movement along the curve. So let's definitely be sure to keep that straight in your mind. Okay. Practice question. Which of the following will cause the quantity supplied of milk to decrease? So let's think about it. Quantity supplied, not a decrease in supply, but a decrease in the quantity supplied. So which of these things is going to cause a decrease in quantity supplied? A decrease in the price of milk. When we're talking about a change in quantity supplied, the only thing that causes a change in quantity supplied is the price. Decrease in the price is going to decrease the quantity supplied. It would be an inverse relationship for demand in terms of increase and decrease. Okay, let's get to, I gave you some practice homework. But instead of what they did, I drew the curve for you. I want you to practice shifting the curve. So I gave you each of these fictional scenarios. And what I would like for you to do is, number one, determine what the shifter is. And then you need to ask yourself, is it going to cause an increase or a decrease because of this particular scenario? And then I want for you to actually, on the back side of your notes, draw the new supply curve. So the existing curve that's there first, I want you to label S sub 1. And then the new supply curve that you're going to draw based off of the change from these scenarios, you're going to label S sub 2. And that's it. That's all I've got for you guys today. So the rest of your time, what I would like for you guys to do is work on your topic packet, and hopefully I'll be back on Thursday. We just have to see how I'm feeling and how I'm breathing. And I think you can hear I'm a little more congested today than I was the other day. So anyways, hopefully I'll see you on Thursday. Work on your packet after you do those couple of practice problems. And like always, if you have any questions, just send me a message in Canvas. Thanks, guys.